The north is cold and full of whispers.
The castle does not sleep. That is the first thing visitors always get wrong about Winterfell. They arrive in the gray light and see the walls and the ravens and the granite, and they think fortress. They think cold. They think a place where people endure rather than live. They are wrong. Beneath the stone, the hot springs run. They have run for thousands of years, longer than the Starks themselves, longer than the Wall, longer perhaps than the name of the North. The water rises through fissures in the bedrock and breathes warmth up through iron grates in the floor, and the kitchen ovens have been burning since 3 hours before dawn, and in the kennels 14 mastiffs carry on a low, constant conversation with the dark, and somewhere in the east wing a forge is already ringing, because the old armorer cannot sleep past 4, and so works instead. This is home. This is what a home feels like from the inside when you belong to it. Jon Snow did not yet know that this was not entirely true. Ned Stark's study smelled of tallow candles and old paper. No fire in the hearth. Ned had let it die 2 hours ago and hadn't noticed the cold. He sat across a narrow table from a slight man who looked nothing like what he was. Syrio Forel was 43 years old. He had the build of a man who spent his life counting coins at a merchant's table, narrow shoulders, careful hands. A face that arranged itself into quiet attentiveness you could mistake for deference if you weren't watching his eyes. The eyes did not defer. The Iron Bank has accepted the letter of credit, Ned said. The arrangement is formal. You will appear in our household records as Master of Accounts, Braavosi Affairs. The Iron Bank, Syrio said, does not send its first swords to manage household ledgers. No, Ned agreed. It sends them where debts are owed. A silence. The candle threw a long shadow across the open ledger between them. Syrio looked at it without looking at it. Your wage will be triple what the crown paid you in King's Landing, Ned continued. Private quarters in the East Tower. Access to the godswood at any hour. No duties beyond the one I am about to describe. And the duty? Ned was quiet for a moment. He had rehearsed this a dozen times and still had not found the right way to say it. There is a boy in this castle, he said finally. He must not be found. And he must be impossible to kill. Syrio studied him. How old? 8. The nature of the threat? The kind, Ned said, that wears crowns. Syrio placed both hands flat on the table. I will see the boy, he said, before I agree to anything. The godswood was still dark when Syrio arrived at its edge. The boy was already there. Syrio stopped at the tree line and watched. He had expected to find someone asleep in the roots, or doing the things boys did alone, throwing rocks at birds, practicing poses stolen from older soldiers. He had not expected this. The boy stood before the heart tree. The weirwood was ancient, broader than 3 men with linked arms, its bark the white of old bone, the carved face in its trunk staring with hollow red eyes into the dark. The sap ran from those carved eyes in thin lines that had stained the wood below them a deep rust brown. The smell of it reached Syrio even at the tree line. Copper and pine and something underneath both of those, something that had no name in Braavosi. The boy was not looking at the tree's face. He was watching its shadow on the ground. After a long moment he bent and picked up a branch. Not randomly, he tested 3 before keeping one, tapping each against his palm, checking the balance at different grip points, the way a craftsman checks timber before cutting it. His breath made small white clouds that the wind took east. His dark hair was tangled from sleep, and he had not noticed. He was entirely inside whatever calculation he was running. Then he began moving, not striking at anything, not pretending to fight. He swung the branch through a specific arc, stopped it, reset, swung again at a different angle, checking each time where the momentum wanted to carry his wrist once the swing completed. Over and over. Methodical, a boy teaching himself the physics of something he had no language for yet. Syrio had been First Sword of Braavos for 9 years. In that time he had seen 3 men he considered genuinely extraordinary with a blade. One was dead. One was at the far edge of the known world. The third was probably going to kill him someday. He picked up a branch of his own. He attacked without greeting, without warning, without any of the sounds a man makes when he wants to be heard. The boy's first instinct was correct. He stepped sideways, not back. Sideways, at an angle, so that Syrio's branch passed through the space where his head had been, and Syrio's momentum carried past him. The boy hadn't seen it coming. His eyes had still been fixed on the heart tree's shadow. But his body had moved correctly anyway. Syrio stopped. Again, he said. They went for an hour. The sky lightened from black to gray to the pale, washed-out blue of a northern winter dawn. The copper smell of the weirwood mixed with the boy's breath and the clean cold of the air above the hot spring ground. Jon was hit 30 times. He hit Syrio twice. The second time, Syrio had let him land it, because he needed to see what the boy did when a blow succeeded. Some children crowed. Some froze in the surprise of their own competence. Jon Snow looked at his branch, looked at where it had glanced off Syrio's ribs, and immediately reset his feet, already calculating what came next. When the hour was done, Syrio walked back to Ned Stark's study without speaking. Ned was still in the same chair, exactly as Syrio had left him. "I will stay," Syrio said. 2 seasons turned. Autumn emptied into the long northern winter. The training moved from the open courtyard to the godswood, Ned's instruction, quietly given and not explained to anyone in the household. The godswood had ancient stone walls and trees thick enough to swallow sound, and the open yard had eyes. Sansa and Robb had appeared once at an upper window early on, watching the strange Braavosi man put Jon through footwork patterns in the cold. They were not at that window the following morning. They were not there the morning after. Ned had spoken with them privately, and neither child asked again. Jon noticed the empty window after 3 weeks. He said nothing about it until one evening, walking back from the godswood, as the light failed. When he asked, "Why does no one watch?" "Your Lord Father has asked that they do not," Syrio said. "Why?" Syrio considered. He did not believe in softening truths. A softened truth was only a delayed wound. "Who," he said instead, "is the most dangerous man in a room?" Jon thought about it the way he thought about all things, seriously, without rushing. "The strongest." "No." "The fastest?" "No." They walked through the godswood dark, their footsteps silent on the unfrozen ground above the hot springs. An owl moved between 2 branches overhead and made no sound at all. "The one," Syrio said, "that nobody has prepared for." Jon turned it over. His eyes moved to the practice sword in his hand, then back to the path ahead. "So if no one knows what I'm learning, then no one can prepare for you." Syrio stopped walking. He waited until Jon stopped too and looked at him. "This is the first lesson. Not the footwork, not the grip. Those come after. The first lesson is this. What happens inside this godswood belongs to no one but us. What you become here, that is ours alone. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "Yes," Jon said. He understood more than Syrio had expected. He usually did. Ned Stark stood at the window of his study and watched the godswood below. The lesson had ended an hour ago. The light was almost gone. The hot spring warmth rose from the ground grates along the garden path and made the air just above the earth shimmer faintly in the cold. Any other boy would have gone inside by now, to supper, to warmth, to the ordinary mercy of an 8-year-old's evening. Jon was still there. He was alone, moving through a footwork drill in the last of the light. His breath fogged steady and even in the cold. He had a bruise under his left eye from a correction that had arrived faster than he'd anticipated, and he had not mentioned it to anyone all day, had not touched it, had not flinched when the winter air reached it. He just kept moving. Pattern, reset, pattern, again. Ned pressed one hand flat against the cold stone of the window frame. He had made a promise in a tower in Dorne, in a room that smelled of blood and the dry heat of the Red Mountains, to a woman who had been dying and who had made him swear on everything he was. He had ridden away from that tower with a baby wrapped in the cloak of a dead Kingsguard, and he had told the lie, and the lie had held, and the boy had grown up calling him father. Now the boy was in the dark below, alone, learning to be impossible to kill. Ned watched until the light was fully gone and Jon was only a shape moving against the pale trunk of the heart tree, a shadow among shadows, already difficult to see. He turned from the window. He still could not decide whether he had kept his promise to Lyanna, or simply armed her son for a war that did not yet have a name. The royal progress stretched for half a mile down the King's Road, and smelled, primarily, of horse. Beyond that, leather, chainmail sweat, the arbor gold the king had been drinking since before noon, and underneath all of it, faint and losing ground, the perfume that Cersei Lannister applied every morning with the precision of a woman who understood that beauty was armor, and armor required maintenance. The column moved at the pace of its slowest wagon. That was very slow. It had been very slow for 6 weeks. Sandor Clegane rode behind Joffrey and thought about nothing. This was the discipline he had developed over 4 years of service to the crown prince of the 7 kingdoms. When the thinking started, the thinking led places. The places were always the same, the calculation of how many men he could kill before they brought him down. The precise geography of what he would do if he were not doing this. The memory of his brother's face in the firelight when Sandor was 7 years old and the thing with the fire happened. None of those were useful. So, he kept the space behind his eyes flat and gray and watched the road and waited for something to require him. Joffrey required him 3 to 5 times a day, on average. He was 12 years old and had the specific cruelty of a boy who had been told he was precious since before he could speak, and had derived from that information all the wrong lessons. The King's Road moved north through the Riverlands. The villages along it had been emptying their best stores for a week. Word traveled ahead of a royal progress the way smell traveled ahead of the progress itself. And farmers and innkeepers had learned that the fastest way to avoid having things taken was to offer them first. It was a form of intelligence that Sandor had come to respect. Know what is coming. Be prepared before it arrives. He had learned something similar. He just hadn't been fast enough. At the rear of Ned Stark's accompanying column, a white shape moved alongside a gray horse. The direwolf pup was 4 months old and already large enough that the stable hands gave it a wide berth. It moved without sound, which was unusual for any animal and particularly unusual for something that size. Several members of the Progress had complained about it. Robert had laughed and told them to stop complaining. The direwolf stayed. The Crossroads Inn appeared at dusk on the 38th day. It was the largest inn in the Riverlands, built wide and low against the junction where the King's Road crossed the River Road going east toward the Erie and west toward River Run. The innkeeper was a heavy-set man with the arms of someone who had moved barrels his entire life, and a manner so deliberately neutral it was itself a kind of performance. A man who had learned to be nothing to powerful people, so that powerful people had no reason to look at him. His daughter was 17, perhaps. She stood in the doorway behind him when the column arrived, watching, and then went back inside quickly, the way women went back inside quickly when an army came down a road. The royal party settled. Horses fed. Guards posted. The king established himself at the largest table and called for wine and got it immediately, which improved his mood enough that dinner passed without incident. Joffrey found the incident on his own. Afterward, he found it the way he always found incidents, by walking through a space where other people existed and waiting for the world to fail to accommodate him sufficiently. The innkeeper's daughter was clearing plates when Joffrey stopped in front of her. He said something Sandor didn't catch. She looked down and moved to step around him. He stepped with her. She stopped. He reached out and lifted her chin with one finger, the way you'd lift the head of an animal you were inspecting. Sandor was already moving. He reached Joffrey in 4 steps and put himself at the prince's left shoulder. "My prince," he said. Quiet, a tone he had learned. Not a warning, not a challenge, just a presence. Often it was enough. The presence of something larger than Joffrey reminded Joffrey, briefly, that the world contained things he couldn't control with his voice. Joffrey glanced at him. Let the girl go. Turned. Then he saw the innkeeper coming from the kitchen with his hands out in the particular way of men who were trying to make themselves appear harmless and unarmed. "Your Grace," the innkeeper said, "if there is anything more I can bring, you were slow with the wine," Joffrey said. "I apologize, Your Grace. We weren't expecting the full. I don't want an apology." Joffrey looked at Sandor. The look was a transaction. It happened between them a dozen times a week. It meant, make this true. Make my displeasure into something this person remembers. Make the world match what I have already decided about it. Sandor looked at the innkeeper, 50 years old. Thick hands, the face of a man who had stood up straight through things that had tried to bend him. His daughter had come back to the kitchen doorway. She was watching her father with the specific terror of someone who understood that her fear could not be seen, because her fear would make it worse. Sandor stepped forward. And then Jon Snow was in the doorway. He wasn't rushing, that was the first thing. He wasn't posturing in the particular way of young men who wanted to be seen stopping something. The wide stance, the hand near the sword, the made-for-watching quality of performed heroism. He just appeared in the space between Sandor and the innkeeper. Traveling leathers, dark gray with the direwolf sigil small on the left breast. Ned Stark's household guard. Nobody had paid him particular attention for 6 weeks on the road. He was the Lord of Winterfell's bastard son, riding north with his father's party. Quiet, unimportant, there, he looked at Sandor, and not at Joffrey. The torchlight from the inn's entrance fell across them both, and for the first time Sandor was close enough to see the boy's face clearly. Not the Stark leather, not the posture, but the face itself. 15 years old, perhaps. Dark. Like a Stark. Gray eyes that were doing something Sandor recognized because he had developed the same habit, scanning, calculating, measuring the room in all directions while appearing to look at only one thing. The light also caught the left side of Sandor's face, the ruined side, the years of scar tissue that pulled the corner of his mouth down and had eaten the ear to a remnant and left the cheekbone visible beneath skin that had healed wrong and would always be wrong. The boy looked at it for exactly 1 second, not the flinch that strangers usually produced, not the deliberate looking away that was worse than the flinch, just a single second of recognition, and then his eyes moved back to Sandor's eyes, and he said, "You could take him. You could take me too, if it came to that." A pause. "And then you'd have to do this again tomorrow." Sandor looked at him. "I'm asking," Jon said, "if you want to." The room held itself very still. Sandor became aware, in the particular way he had developed over years of watching for threats, that this boy was standing in a space between him and another human being, without any of the things that usually held someone upright in that position. No political protection, no backup, no bluster. Just the question. Just the calm, level, completely unafraid question. "Do you want to?" He thought about it. Joffrey said from behind him, "Clegane." Sandor turned. "The innkeeper tripped," he said. "Sprained his wrist. He should rest it." He kept his voice flat, bored, definitive, the voice he used when he was making something true by saying it. "The wine'll be slow the rest of the night." He steered Joffrey by the shoulder toward his table and his cup, and Joffrey went, because Joffrey always went when Sandor steered him, because some part of Joffrey's body understood Sandor in a way Joffrey's mind was too proud to admit. When Sandor looked back at the doorway, Jon Snow was already gone. Outside, in the dark near the inn's water trough, a white shape sat perfectly still and watched the doorway with red eyes. The stables were quiet 2 hours after midnight. Sandor went to check the horses. He checked the horses every night, a habit from a time before King's Landing, before Joffrey, before everything that had calcified around him, when he had been younger and the small rituals of care had meant something. He checked the horses because the horses never looked at his face the wrong way. Jon was there. Same reason, apparently they stood on opposite sides of a gray mare that Ned Stark had ridden for 3 years and that had the comfortable, self-possessed quality of an animal that had been well treated for a long time. Ghost lay at the stable entrance watching them both with those blood-colored eyes, making no sound. "Who taught you to do that?" Sandor said. Not a question. He didn't phrase things as questions when he already knew there was an answer. "A man named Syrio Forel." Sandor looked up. In 17 years of violence, in every corner of the 7 kingdoms, certain names had mass. The First Sword of Braavos. "He was," Jon said. "Now he's master of accounts, Braavosi affairs, in Winterfell's household ledgers." Sandor moved to the next stall. What do they want with you up north?" Jon looked at him across the horse's back. The stable lantern was low, and the light it threw was orange and unsteady. It caught the bones of Jon's face at an angle, the jaw, the dark eyes. The quality of absolute stillness that Sandor had seen in perhaps 4 other people in his life, and all 4 of them had been extremely dangerous. "Same thing you're doing here," Jon said. "A job." Sandor made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the sound a man makes when something is funny and he has forgotten how to be amused. "My job," he said, "is following that little—" He stopped, found a different word. "My job has its complications. So does mine. Your job is safer." Jon was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted. Outside, a night bird moved through the dark above the inn's roof, and its wing beats faded going east. Ghost turned his head toward the sound and then back. "So is yours," Jon said, "if you want it." Sandor said nothing. He finished checking the horses. He walked back to the inn. He lay on his bedroll in the room assigned to Joffrey's guard, and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep, and the thinking that he usually kept flat and gray and featureless moved through him like water through a cracked dam. In the morning he was still riding behind Joffrey, but he was watching different things. He was watching Jon Snow. He was measuring. Power has a smell. It smells like horses that have been fed better than most men, and leather oiled every day by someone whose only job is oiling leather, and the specific human sweat of people who have never been cold enough to wonder if the cold would kill them. If you haven't subscribed to the Patreon yet, the link is in the description. Exclusive timelines, members-only content, and alternate history that goes deeper than anything on the main channel. Now, Winterfell. They came through the gates like a country arriving inside a castle. 300 people. Wagons, horses, banners, the smell of King's Landing imported wholesale into the north. The crowned stag of House Baratheon snapped above the column in the cold wind, and the lion of House Lannister moved beside it. Gold on crimson, permanent and self-satisfied. Robert Baratheon rode at the front, and he was enormous. Not the enormous of a man in his power, the enormous of a man who had been powerful once, and had since then replaced the muscle with something else, wine mostly, and grief, and the specific weight of a life that had turned out to be nothing like what he'd killed for. He rode his horse like he was grateful it hadn't complained yet. He was laughing at something one of his knights had said, and the laugh was genuine, which was the most dangerous thing about Robert Baratheon. The laugh was always genuine, which made you forget, briefly, that the hands doing the laughing had killed a prince on the Trident. Jon stood in the yard with Ned's household guard. He wore Stark leather, dark gray, the direwolf small on his chest. His hood was down. He had been in this yard 1,000 times, and he stood in it now the way he stood in every room he entered, slightly left of center back quarter angle to the nearest wall, nothing behind him that he hadn't already checked. The 7 years with Syrio had made this automatic. He no longer noticed doing it. Ghost sat at his heel, white and silent, watching the column pour through the gates with those red eyes that the column's horses did not enjoy. The horses kept a wide berth. Ghost did not move. Jaime Lannister rode near the column's head in white Kingsguard plate that had been polished to a brightness that seemed to generate its own light in the gray northern morning. He was 31 years old, and moved on a horse the way things moved when they had been beautiful their entire lives, and had never once had to think about it. He surveyed Winterfell's yard with the calm, pleasant detachment of a man looking at a painting he had already decided was adequate. His eyes passed over Jon Snow without stopping. It happened on the second morning. The royal party had eaten and rested, and the yard had been cleared for exercise. The Kingsguard needed space to train, and the household guard needed to be somewhere else. Jaime Lannister worked through a blade drill alone in the center of the yard, with the loose, unconscious precision of a man for whom excellence had long ago stopped requiring effort. Several northern lords had drifted to the yard's edges, some of Ned's bannermen, 2 of Robb's companions. They watched Jaime the way men watch things that were better than them at something they had dedicated their lives to, with a professional attention that was several layers of feeling deep, and respect was only the top one. Jaime finished the drill and rolled his right shoulder and said to no one in particular, Castle training in the north produces men who would be defeated by squires in the south. Not an insult, just a different climate. Fewer tournaments, less competition. You produce fighters who are exceptional until they face someone who has been fighting the exceptional all their lives. He was half joking. He was also entirely sincere, which was worse. Lord Glover went red at the collar. Sir Roderick Castle's jaw locked. Nobody said anything, because Jaime Lannister was a Kingsguard and Cersei's brother, and by any honest reckoning, possibly the finest swordsman alive, and those facts combined into a silence that had mass. Jon said, "I'll go." Not loudly, not moving from where he stood at the yard's edge. The way you'd offer to carry a heavy bag downstairs. Jaime turned and found him. Looked at the stark leather, the age, the complete absence of anything that resembled performance or challenge. "You," he said, in the pleasant voice of a man who has just been mildly surprised. Ned's bastard, not cruel, just identifying. How old? 15? Jaime looked at him for another moment, then picked up a practice sword from the rack at the yard's edge and held it out. "Then I'll be gentle," he said, still pleasantly. Jon took the sword, his left foot angled out. His right hand dropped a half-inch lower on the hilt than the grip point that every trained swordsman in that yard would have recognized. Jaime noticed the grip. His eyes moved down and back up. The pleasantness remained, but something behind it had adjusted. Jaime moved first, a standard opening, lateral cut, mid-level, designed to establish the reach and set the distance of the engagement. Clean, textbook. The kind of opening that taught you everything you needed to know about an opponent inside the first 2 seconds. Jon was not where the cut arrived. He hadn't stepped back. He had drifted left and forward simultaneously, at an angle to Jaime's right that put him outside the cut's arc and inside Jaime's recovery space before Jaime's sword arm had finished moving. His practice blade came up not in a block, but a redirect, the flat of it against the flat of Jaime's, minimal contact. Using the momentum that was already there to push the blade further past where it had already gone. Jaime recovered in a half-second. For most men, that would have been long enough to take the touch. Jon had already moved again. This was the thing that could not be prepared for and could not be explained to someone who had not seen it. The footwork patterns were not Westerosi. They had no Westerosi name. They had been developed in Braavos over centuries for a specific purpose, not to win duels, but to make the opponent's understanding of where you were going perpetually wrong. Jaime Lannister had trained against the finest swordsmen in the Seven Kingdoms for 20 years. His body knew what good footwork looked like. This did not look like good footwork. It looked like something was slightly wrong, like the angles were slightly off, like the boy was about to make an error, and then somehow the error was Jaime's. Jaime stopped tracking the feet. He watched the hips instead. The hips always led the true movement. Every swordmaster knew this. He waited for the hip turn that preceded the thrust. Jon stepped inside his guard. He did not drive forward. He reduced the distance between them gradually, over 3 exchanges, in increments small enough that each individual step looked like recovery rather than approach. And then suddenly there was no distance. And at close range the water dance footwork became something else entirely. It became what Sandor Clegane had spent months adding to it on the road north, which was the knowledge of what a man's body did when the space he needed to swing a sword was no longer available to him. Jaime shifted to short cuts. Jon controlled his sword arm at the elbow, not grabbing, positioning, the way you positioned a door rather than blocked it. 3 exchanges. 5. Jaime made the move he had never failed with, a specific feint, an inside turn. A lunge that had ended 100 matches because it exploited the 2-step recovery pause that every trained swordsman's body performed automatically after a redirect. He had beaten better men than this with it. He had beaten men who knew it was coming. Jon was not in the lunge's path. His practice blade touched the inside of Jaime Lannister's right wrist. Touch, dead the yard was very quiet. Robert Baratheon's laugh arrived like a physical event. It came from the chest, from somewhere below conscious decision. The laugh of a man who has been genuinely surprised for the first time in years, and whose body remembered how to respond before his mind caught up. He was leaning against the far wall with a cup he had brought from breakfast, and he straightened off the wall, and the laugh came out of him, and he did not try to stop it. Sandor Clegane stood 20 feet back, arms crossed, and uncrossed them. It was a small motion. Nobody who wasn't watching for it would have seen it. In the East Tower's second window, a slight Braavosi man looked down at the yard and said nothing to the empty room. Cersei Lannister stood at the Great Hall's entrance behind a face that was perfectly calm in the way that very cold water was perfectly calm. Nothing moved in it. Nothing would move in it until she was somewhere private. Ghost, who had been sitting against the yard's far wall throughout, turned his red gaze from the yard to the window where Syrio stood and then back, and made no sound. Jaime looked at his right wrist, looked at Jon. The pleasantness was still there, and underneath it something had shifted, not bruised pride, or not only that, something more specific, the professional attention of a man who had just seen something he didn't have a category for. Again, Jaime said. They went 3 more rounds. Jon won the second. Jon won the third. Jaime won the fourth with everything he had, and the full force of 20 years of being the best, and when it was over, he was breathing harder than he had from the first 3 combined. He lowered his practice sword, and looked at Jon Snow for a long moment. "Who taught you that?" he said. "More than one person," Jon said. That night at the feast, Robert Baratheon's voice carried to every corner of the Great Hall. "Ned," he said, loud enough that the nearest 30 people stopped their own conversations, "your bastard is wasted in the north. A boy who fights like that belongs at court. Give him to me. I'll make something of him." Ned smiled the way Ned smiled when he was navigating ice in the dark, carefully, without appearing to. "He belongs at Winterfell, your grace. He's still young. He made Jaime Lannister sweat," Robert said. "He is not too young for anything." He drank and laughed and moved on to another subject. The 30 people who had heard went back to their own conversations. By morning, all 300 members of the Royal Progress were recalculating something they thought they had already understood. Bran's room smelled of tallow and the particular stillness of a body that was present but not inhabited. He had been breathing for 7 days since the fall. The maester had a word for what he was doing. The word was sleeping. And it was technically accurate the way that technically accurate things sometimes failed completely to describe what they meant. Bran was not sleeping. Sleep was something you came back from. What Bran was doing had no guaranteed direction. Catelyn Tully Stark sat in the chair beside his bed and had not truly left it in 6 days. She had gray beneath her eyes and the specific stillness of a woman who had decided that movement was a kind of surrender. She held Bran's hand. His hand held nothing back. The castle had quieted hours ago. The Royal Progress retired early when Robert had drunk enough, which was earlier each night. The corridors were guard quiet, torch quiet. The particular silence of a fortress at 3 hours past midnight when even the sentries had settled into the long patience of their watch. Jon Snow was not sleeping. He sat with his back against the corridor wall outside Bran's door, knees up, hood down, listening to Winterfell breathe. This had been his position for 6 nights running. No one had told him to be here. Ned had not asked it. Catelyn had not acknowledged it, which was its own form of permission from a woman who acknowledged nothing about Jon Snow unless she had to. Ghost lay beside him, pressed against his thigh white in the corridor's dark, his red eyes open and fixed on the servant door at the corridor's far end. Ghost did not sleep when Jon did not sleep. He had not slept in 6 nights. Jon was looking at the opposite wall when Ghost's ears moved, not toward the main corridor entrance, toward the servant door at the corridor's far end. A half-rotation, precise, the way Ghost oriented when something was close enough to hear, but not yet close enough to smell. Jon did not move. The latch not catching on the servant door meant the door had been prepared earlier in the day. The wood held back the way wood held back when it had been oiled recently, and by someone who understood what they were oiling it for. Jon filed this and stayed still and listened to the footsteps come down the corridor. Professional quiet. Not the quiet of someone moving carefully, the quiet of someone for whom careful had become ordinary, and ordinary had become automatic. The footsteps were not slow. Slow was obvious in a quiet corridor. They were exactly the speed of a guard doing a normal pass, and they were in the precise center of the corridor where the stones were most worn and therefore most predictable underfoot. Jon stayed against the wall. Ghost did not move, but his red eyes tracked the approaching darkness without blinking. The footsteps stopped at Bran's door. The man was inside for 4 seconds before Jon moved. He gave him 4 seconds because 4 seconds was enough to commit, enough to be past the threshold, past the possibility of explaining himself as lost or confused or performing some household function. 4 seconds was intent made physical. Jon went through the door low. Ghost did not follow. Jon had put his hand briefly on Ghost's neck before rising, one touch, and Ghost understood what it meant the way Ghost always understood what things meant before Jon could explain them. He stayed. He watched the door. The man was at Bran's bedside. He had the dagger out, a thin blade that caught the single candle's light in a way that ordinary steel did not. A rippled quality to the metal, dark and cold. He was leaning over the bed, and Catelyn was already half risen from her chair, her mouth open, a half second from the scream that would bring everyone and be too late. Jon did not draw. Drawing took a second he didn't have, and made a sound he didn't want. The man began to turn at the sound of the door. This was the moment Sandor had described in the stable yard at Winterfell 3 months after the progress arrived, on a cold morning when he was teaching Jon something that had no formal name, but that Sandor described as simply the thing that happens. A man whose plan fails suddenly experiences 2 seconds in which his body knows the plan has failed, but his mind has not yet produced a replacement. In those 2 seconds the body freezes. It is not cowardice, it is the processing time of a mind working at full speed. Every man experienced it, including professionals, including men who had done this many times and survived. The man turned and found Jon already inside the distance at which the dagger was useful. Jon used the doorframe that his shoulder was already past, used it as a pivot point. Catching the man's dagger arm at the wrist with his left hand, and the man's collar with his right, and turned, and the doorframe and the man's own rotational momentum did the rest. The floor arrived for the man quickly. Jon's knee found the pressure point below the man's shoulder blade, and the dagger hand opened. 6 seconds. The man was breathing. Jon picked up the dagger. Catelyn stood on the other side of Bran's bed, with her hands pressed flat to the coverlet, staring. Bran had not moved. The single candle threw everything in orange and shadow. The man on the floor was trying to decide whether to try something, and Jon put his knee into the pressure point again briefly to help him decide. The man stopped trying. Jon held the dagger up to the candle. The rippled dark metal. The balance of it was wrong in the way that Valyrian steel was always wrong, lighter than it should have been, the edge too clean, the kind of clean that didn't come from a whetstone. He turned it once, slowly, then he showed it to Catelyn. Her eyes went to it, and her face changed in a way she did not intend and could not stop. "Tell me your name," Jon said. He was crouched beside the man, his voice level, the dagger resting flat on his own thigh. Not raised, not threatening, simply present. The man said nothing. His face was doing the professional recalibration, the settling into silence, the decision to give nothing, the performance of someone who knew that names led to things. "You don't have to," Jon said. "The name isn't actually what I need." He turned the dagger once on his thigh. "This blade is worth more than you earn in a year. You know that. Whoever hired you wanted certainty, not a cheap knife in the dark, but Valyrian steel, a weapon that doesn't fail. That means they were afraid of something going wrong. They spent that much to make sure it didn't." He paused. It went wrong anyway. The man looked at the ceiling. "Here is what happens now," Jon said, the same level voice. No change in it. Whoever hired you is not expecting you back with a failure. A professional returns with completion or doesn't return. That's how it works. So you cannot go back. And you cannot stay in Winterfell. Which means your value is entirely in what you know, and entirely to me. "Because I'm the only one in this room willing to exchange something for it," Catelyn said, from above. "Jon, my lady." He did not look up. "Please," silence, then her breathing, and Bran's, and the candle. "There will be more," Jon said to the man. "After you. When you don't return, they'll recalculate. They'll send someone else or find another way. I cannot stop that without knowing where it comes from." "You know where it comes from." He let that sit for a moment. "Tell me now. Walk out of Winterfell tonight. Alive, with a horse from the east stable that no one will notice missing until morning. Don't tell me your name. Just the name of who hired you." The man's eyes moved from the ceiling to Jon's face, measuring, the calculation of a professional who had just run out of the options that didn't include talking. "A dwarf," the man said. His voice was rough, the accent from somewhere in the Westerlands. "I was given the name by a middleman. Couldn't confirm it myself. But the middleman said the dwarf. The queen's brother. The imp." The candle guttered in a breath of air from the gap beneath the door. Catelyn made a sound that was not quite a word. Jon looked at the dagger on his thigh for a long moment. Then he stood and put it in his belt and looked at the man on the floor. "East stable. Gray mare with the white forelock. Her stall is third on the left. Take nothing else." The man left. Jon listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, the same professional quiet as before, unchanged by what had just happened. Some men were like that. What happened to them rearranged very little on the surface. He turned to Catelyn. She was looking at the dagger at his belt with her hand still flat on Bran's coverlet. "Don't move on this," Jon said. "Not while the progress is still here. Not while 300 Lannister eyes can watch what you do with your face when you look at Cersei." He looked at Bran, still breathing, still absent. "Tell my father in the morning. No one else." "Not yet." Catelyn said nothing. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were wet, and she was the most controlled person Jon had ever watched be afraid. He went back to the corridor, sat against the wall. Ghost pressed immediately against his side, warm and solid, and Jon buried his hand in the white fur without thinking about it. He put the dagger flat on his knee and stared at the rippled dark metal in the corridor and the servant door at the far end that someone had oiled in the afternoon, and he did not sleep at all. Everything south of the neck is a different country. Not in the way of laws or lords or the banners flying over keeps, in the way that the air itself carries different information, and your body, if it has been paying attention, knows it before your mind does. If you want exclusive timelines and members-only content that goes deeper than the main channel, the Patreon link is in the description. Now, the road south. The morning Ned's party left Winterfell, the gate came down behind them at first light, and Jon did not look back. He had learned this from Syrio, who had learned it somewhere that predated his time as First Sword, and had never explained where. You looked at what was ahead. You looked at what was beside you. You looked back only when the information behind you was more useful than the information in front of you, and that was rarely. His leathers were cut differently from the household guards. The distinction was small enough that most people would not see it, and large enough that anyone who knew what they were looking at would. The collar sat away from his neck rather than against it, half an inch of clearance that meant nothing for warmth and everything for movement, for the ability to turn his head at full extension without the leather catching. The cloak pinned at his left shoulder only, leaving the right arm entirely free from collarbone to wrist. His sword sat fractionally further forward on the belt than standard guard placement. These were not decorations. They were the accumulated decisions of 7 years of being taught by people who had thought very carefully about what got men killed. Ghost moved alongside his horse at a lope, white against the gray morning road, silent as he always was, drawing eyes from the column's edges the way unusual things drew eyes, without demanding them, just by existing. Sandor Clegane rode at the column's rear. Robert had made the reassignment 3 nights before the progress departed, drunkenly, enthusiastically, in front of enough witnesses that the Lannisters could not unpick it without making a formal grievance to the king they were not yet ready to make. Sandor had said nothing when Ned formally accepted him. He had moved his horse to the rear of Ned's column the following morning, and had been there every day since. Syrio Forel rode in a covered wagon with 6 crates of books and the household ledgers, and the title of Master of Accounts, Braavosi Affairs. He read during the entire journey. When Jon passed the wagon on horseback, he could see Syrio's hand moving across a page with a quill, annotating something in the small, cramped notation he used, pausing occasionally to look at nothing for a moment, and then returning to the page. He had said goodbye to Winterfell by eating breakfast, packing his books, and getting in the wagon. He had not looked at the castle as they left. Jon had not asked him about it. Some things were not questions. On the second day's ride, a raven caught them. It came from behind, from Winterfell, a messenger bird dispatched 2 days after their departure, which meant it carried information generated after they had already left. The rider who intercepted it brought it to Ned at the front of the column. Ned read it while still mounted, and Jon was 20 feet back when he saw Ned's face change. Not outwardly. Nothing moved in Ned Stark's face that Ned Stark did not permit to move. But something behind the eyes shifted, a weight adjusting, settling differently, the specific change of a man who has received information he has been dreading and simultaneously waiting for. Ned folded the letter, put it in his cloak, rode on. He did not look at Jon. That evening, at the campfire after the meal was done and the column had quieted down, Ned came to Jon's fire. He sat. He looked at the coals for a moment. "A raven from Maester Luwin," he said. "Quiet. Bran woke this morning." Jon's hands were still. "He cannot remember everything," Ned continued. The fall. The tower. What he saw inside before he fell. A pause that had weight in it. But he remembers enough. He told Luwin. Luwin wrote it down. The letter is specific. He looked at the coals. "It confirms what the man in Bran's room told you." Jon said nothing for a moment. Then, does he know Jaime pushed him? He does not remember a push. He remembers climbing. He remembers a window. He remembers seeing something he should not have seen. Ned turned the letter's fold between his fingers without opening it again. His words, as Luwin recorded them. A man and a woman. Together, inside the tower. The fire moved between them. "It's enough," Jon said. "Yes," Ned said. "It is." He left. Jon stared at the coals for a long time after. The King's Road south of Winterfell moved through country that became incrementally less itself the further it went. The pine forests thinned. The air lost the sharp mineral quality of the far north, the smell of frozen stone and deep cold that Jon had breathed his entire life, and replaced it with something softer, more complicated. The damp loam smell of a landscape that thawed every year and therefore carried centuries of decomposition in its soil. By the third day they were past Moat Cailin, through the next impossible marshland into the riverlands. The sky was larger here. The horizon went further. Jon spent most of the first Riverlands morning looking at it, which was not a useful activity in which he allowed himself anyway, because the usefulness of certain things was difficult to assess in advance. Ghost ranged wider here than he did in the north, moving through the roadside brush with that soundless particular efficiency, returning always to Jon's horse at intervals that Jon had stopped timing, because they were always exactly the same. The hedge knight found them at a way station on the afternoon of the fourth day. He was camped at the station's water trough when Ned's column arrived, a man in mismatched plate with a red and white sigil Jon didn't recognize on a battered shield propped against the trough. 40 years old approximately, the kind of body that had been strong once and had kept the width without keeping the rest. He looked at Ned's column arriving and made the calculation that hedge knights made, which was, how much of what's here is mine to take, and how much will cost more than it provides. He looked at Jon, stark leather, no house sigil large enough to see at distance, young, traveling at the column's edge, and decided Jon was his to take. "Boy," he said, loudly enough to carry, "you're blocking the trough." Jon was not blocking the trough. He was 12 feet from it. He looked at the hedge knight. He did not move. "I said you're blocking," Jon said something. He said it quietly enough that the nearest rider, 6 feet away, caught only the shape of it, the consonants, the cadence, not the words. The hedge knight heard it. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in 4 seconds. The first was the continuation of his performance, the second was a recalibration, and the third was the specific blankness of a man who has suddenly understood something about the situation he is, in that he had not understood 5 seconds ago. The hedge knight sat down on the edge of the trough. "My apologies," he said. "Carry on." He did not make eye contact with anyone in the column as they passed. Sandor watched this from the rear. He filed it and said nothing, and thought about it for the next 2 hours. Ned's tent that night was the largest in the camp and still smaller than any room in Winterfell. A folding table, 2 camp chairs, a candle. The maps he needed were already rolled and stored because he had memorized them years ago. Jon sat across from him and waited. Ned said, "King's Landing is not Winterfell." "No, in Winterfell your word carries weight because I have given it weight, because men know who I am and have decided, through whatever calculation men make, that I am trustworthy, and they extend that judgment to what is mine." He looked at the candle rather than at Jon. "In King's Landing you have no name. You are my bastard son, my shadow. Nothing more and nothing less, and that is precisely what you must remain. I understand. You don't yet. You think you do, because you understand it as a concept." Ned moved his eyes from the candle to Jon's face. "Every day in that city there will be a reason to use the blade. Someone will say something about your birth. Someone will move against someone you care about. Someone will do something where the blade is the correct answer, and the fastest answer, and the answer your hands will want to find before you've finished thinking." He paused. "That impulse will get us all killed." Jon said nothing. "Syrio taught you speed," Ned said. "Sandor taught you force. I have nothing left to teach you about fighting. I need you to learn something that neither of them could give you, because it is not a thing that can be trained. It can only be decided." He looked at Jon steadily. Silence. The decision to know something and not use it. To see an opening and not take it. To be the most dangerous person in a room and ensure that no one in that room suspects it. That is what King's Landing requires. That is what will keep us alive. Jon held this. "Then, who taught you that?" Ned looked at the candle for a long time. "Life," he said, and did not say more. The campfire Jon shared with Sandor was smaller than the others and set 20 feet from the nearest group, which was not an accident on either side. They ate without talking. The fire was low and orange and threw heat without throwing much light. Ghost lay between them, stretched flat on the ground, his white fur almost luminous in the firelight, his eyes half closed but not entirely. Sandor looked at him once, then at the stars. In the firelight, on the low side where the shadow fell differently, Sandor's face showed the full geography of the burn. The skin that had healed by contracting rather than by returning to what it was. The ear. The pulled corner of the mouth. The firelight found it the way firelight always found it, because fire had opinions about Sandor Clegane that Sandor could do nothing about. He sat with it the way he had sat with it for 20 years. He did not turn away from the fire. He had decided once, a long time ago, that turning away from fire was a concession he would not make. Jon did not look at it. He had learned, on the road, that not looking was the correct thing, not the polite thing, the correct thing, because Sandor's face was not information Sandor offered for commentary, and treating it as such was its own form of insult. "Never been this far from Lannister territory in 10 years, Sandor said. The fire moved between them. "Does it feel different?" Jon asked. Sandor turned the question over. "Don't know yet," he said. They ate. After a while Sandor said, "Syrio told me something. Before we left." Jon waited. Said you were the best student he'd ever had. Sandor looked into the fire rather than at Jon. "I've heard him say things about technique. Footwork, timing. Never heard him say that." "He says the same thing to you," Jon said. Sandor looked up. "I'm not his student." "I know. That's not what he means." Ghost's ear moved once, tracking something in the dark beyond the fire's reach, then settled. "What does he mean?" Sandor said. Jon looked at the fire for a moment. "He means you taught me everything he couldn't. The part that isn't craft. The part that's just, surviving what's in front of you regardless of what it is." He paused. He respects that more than the footwork. He'd never say so. Sandor was quiet for a long time. The stars moved their slow arc overhead, and the camp settled around them into the deep sounds of 100 men trying to sleep on ground that was not designed for sleeping. "King's Landing," Sandor said eventually. It wasn't a question. It wasn't anything with a category. It was the word itself, placed in the air between them, weighted with whatever it meant to a man who knew it from the inside. "Yes," Jon said. Sandor looked back at the stars. Ghost shifted, pressed closer to Jon's leg and was still. Jon was asleep before the fire went out, which was the first night in 3 weeks that he had slept before the fire went out. Sandor sat with the embers until they were gray. He was still thinking about something and had not yet decided what it was. The smell arrived before the city did. That was the thing nobody told you. You expected to see it first: the walls, the towers, the red keep sitting above everything like a fist of red stone against the sky. Instead, you smelled it. 2 miles out, on the approach road through the Kingswood, the wind shifted and brought it north, and Jon's horse moved its head sideways and blew through its nose once. Hard. The way horses processed information they had no category for. Ghost stopped on the road beside Jon's horse and lifted his head and sampled the air for a long moment, and whatever King's Landing smelled like to a direwolf produced no reaction Jon could read. Ghost lowered his head and kept walking. Tanneries, fish drying on racks somewhere near water. Bread from 100 ovens that had been burning since before dawn. The specific sweetness of rotting vegetables at volume, which was the smell of any market large enough to waste more than it sold. Human bodies in their thousands, in summer, without enough water. And over all of it, underneath all of it, the Blackwater Bay. Salt and mud and the cold mineral smell of deep water pushed up against the land, which was the one clean note in the composition. Syrio was sitting beside Jon on the wagon bench. He had put his book away when the smell arrived. He breathed in slowly, the way a man breathed when he was cataloging rather than simply inhaling. "This is what ambition smells like," he said. "Breathe carefully." They entered through the river gate in the late afternoon, and the city closed around them like a hand. Jon had grown up understanding scale in the way that people who lived in large castles understood it, in terms of stone and height and the distance between walls. King's Landing was a different kind of large. It was large in the way that things were large when they had grown rather than been built, when they had no plan behind them except the plan of 10,000 people all deciding to be in the same place, because other people were already there. The streets were too narrow for the traffic moving through them. The buildings leaned toward each other overhead until the strip of sky above each lane was the width of a man's shoulders. Everything was vertical and close and loud. Jon rode through it with his hood up and looked at everything. The Red Keep rose ahead of them above the city's levels, built on the hill called Aegon's High Hill, its walls the color of old blood in the late light. It was the most visible thing in the city from any angle, which was the point. A building that could be seen from everywhere was a building that was always reminding you of something. Ned's party was housed in the Tower of the Hand, which connected to the Red Keep's main structure by a covered bridge at the 4th level. Jon's room was at the tower's 3rd floor, a narrow chamber with a window that faced east across the city's rooftops toward the bay. The view showed him the geometry of the place, the lanes and markets and the Seps dome and the harbor's curve, and he sat at that window on the first night and did not sleep, and studied it the way Syrio had taught him to study an opponent's body before the match began. Ghost lay across the doorway. The servants who came to the room the first morning stepped over him carefully and did not comment. Jon was looking for the weight distribution, where the power sat, where it moved from and where it moved to. By the 3rd night he had a partial answer. Syrio found them on the 7th day. He said them because there were 3, all working within 40 feet of the Tower of the Hand's main entrance. One sold bread from a cart. One swept the courtyard stones with a broom that he moved in a specific pattern that had nothing to do with where the dirt was. One sat on a step mending a boot that, on close observation, had been mended in the same place 4 times already. "Watch the eyes," Syrio said. He and Jon were crossing the courtyard at a normal pace. A minor lord and his Braavosi accountant performing a minor errand. Not what they look at, where they return to. Jon watched without appearing to watch. He had been practicing this for 7 years. It did not require him to slow down or change his head's angle. The bread seller looked at the courtyard, the Tower of the Hand's entrance, a specific window on the 2nd floor, a specific window on the 4th floor, then back to the courtyard. The interval between returns was almost exactly 40 seconds. The window on the 2nd floor, Jon said, and the 4th. 2 contacts. 1 relay. The man with the broom reports to the bread seller, Syrio said. The man with the boot reports to someone we have not yet identified. This is Littlefinger's work. You can identify his networks because he uses three-layer chains. No direct reporting. Always one man between the watcher and the receiver. He said this with the professional appreciation of someone who respected craft, regardless of whose craft it was. He has been building this for years. These people are not paid informants. They are invested. They have arrangements, debts, protections. They will not be removed by bribery. Then how? Jon said. Syrio was quiet for 11 steps. A lying tongue is most useful when the lies it tells are mostly true. We do not remove the network. We become part of it. It took 9 days. The principle was simple in the way that only very sophisticated things were simple. Feed the network information that was consistently accurate and occasionally very valuable, and the relay's trust deepened. Then introduce information that was subtly wrong in ways that could not be traced back to a specific source. Wrong in ways that seemed like honest error. Wrong in ways that only became wrong 3 weeks later when an event failed to occur as predicted, and the relay's confidence in this source eroded without anyone understanding why. On the 19th day, moving through the lower corridors of the Tower of the Hand, Syrio stopped Jon at the junction of the Servant Passage and the South Stairwell. "The network found something 3 nights ago," he said. His voice was without inflection, the tone he used when the information was significant, and the significance required no performance. "The King's Squire, the one assigned to the bedchamber wine service. He has been receiving payment from a Lannister household source. The payment began 6 months ago." A pause. The squire refills Robert's cup before it empties, before Robert can track how much he has consumed. Jon was still. "We identified the payment chain on the 2nd day," Syrio continued. "We have been replacing the squire's wine since the 15th day. What Robert receives in his cup now is what he pours himself from the flagon, not what the squire adds." He looked at Jon with the mild attention that was his default expression. Robert Baratheon is drinking less than he believes himself to be drinking. He does not notice, because a man who has been drinking heavily for years loses the calibration to notice. "He's more present than they think," Jon said. "He is considerably more present than they think," Syrio said. "And he is angry about things he cannot quite name, which is the particular anger of a man who suspects he is being managed and cannot yet prove it." He turned to go. "This is useful. File it." Jon's first encounter with what King's Landing was actually built from happened on the 19th day. He was crossing the lower corridor of the Tower of the Hand when Lord Mallion intercepted him. Mallion was 60, a minor lord with a seat somewhere in the Crown Lands, precisely important enough to know that he needed to perform importance constantly to maintain it. He looked at Jon the way men of 60 looked at young men in stark leather, whose names they had not bothered to learn. "You there," Mallion said. "Fetch me the steward. I need the evening's meal arrangements confirmed." Jon stopped. He looked at Mallion without expression. "My lord," he said pleasantly, "I'm afraid the steward's time is committed until the 4th hour. If you'd like to leave your requirements with me, I'll ensure they're addressed." Mallion frowned. Something was wrong with this response, and he couldn't immediately identify what. "Who are you exactly?" "Jon Snow. Lord Stark's household." Mallion recalibrated. "A bastard, not a servant," which explained the leather and the manner, but not exactly someone whose manner should carry that quality of complete unruffledness. He tried a different approach. "Lord Stark's bastard. Yes, I've heard of you." He said it the way you said something when what you meant was that the thing you'd heard was not flattering. "You'll want to be careful about your position here, boy. King's Landing is not the North. A bastard without a name is a specific kind of nothing here." Jon looked at him for a moment. He said something quiet. 3 sentences. Mallion's expression moved through uncertainty into a very specific blankness, and then into the face of a man who was recalculating something he had been certain of, and finding the certainty was no longer available to him. Mallion said, "Yes." "Well," and went back the way he'd come. Jon continued to the end of the corridor and up the stairs. That evening Syrio came to his room. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the city below, the lights coming on as darkness arrived, the red keep's towers lit from within, the black water a black mirror at the city's edge. Ghost lay across the foot of the bed and watched Syrio with the patient attention he gave to everything. "You dismantled Mallion," Syrio said. "He dismantled himself. Tell me how." Jon considered. He told me what he thought I was. What he thought I was told me what he was afraid of. What he was afraid of told me the 3 things I needed to say. He paused. It took 4 seconds. Syrio nodded once, the slow nod he used for things that required no addition. Then he said, "In Braavos, a Braavo's name is his first weapon. Before the blade, before the footwork, before any of it. The name. Men step aside for a man whose blade they have already decided to fear, and they decide that through reputation, through rumor, through the story that arrives in a room before the man does." He looked out at the Red Keep, across the city's dark. This city runs on the same principle. Reputation. Fear, the story that precedes the person. But here, they do not earn it with duels. They earn it with whispers. "So we whisper," Jon said. "We do something more precise." Syrio stood. He moved to the window and looked down at the streets below for a long moment. The city breathed its complicated smell up at them: ambition, rot, salt, bread. We ensure that the right people fear the right things, specifically and correctly. The whispers arrange themselves after that. They always do. He left. Jon sat at the window for a long time. The Red Keep looked back at him across the rooftops, lit and patient, full of things that had been waiting a very long time for someone to be afraid of them. He picked up the candle from the table. His shadow went up the wall behind him, enormous, and stayed there when he moved. The lowest room in the Tower of the Hand had been a storage cellar for 3 generations of hands, and smelled accordingly: old wine, old wood, the particular damp of stone that had been underground long enough to forget it had ever been anything else. Syrio had cleared a space on the floor and unrolled the map there, because the table was too small, and the floor did not lie about dimensions the way tables sometimes did. He had drawn the map himself over 6 weeks from memory and observation, and the information that moved through Littlefinger's adjusted network, and occasionally from simply walking corridors at odd hours with the ledger under his arm and the expression of a man performing a minor administrative errand. The map was accurate to within 3 feet in most places, and accurate to within 1 foot in the places that mattered. The 3 of them crouched around it. 1 candle. 12 minutes, Jon said. That's what the rotation gives us between the 4th-level corridor going clear and the replacement guard reaching the west stair. 11, Syrio said. The guard at the west stair arrives early on cold nights. He does not like the cold. It has been cold for 4 nights. 11, then. Sandor was looking at the map with the attention of a man reading terrain he had moved through in the dark many times, but from a different angle. His finger traced a corridor on the 3rd level without touching the map, hovering a half-inch above the parchment, following the line. "Trant takes the east wing on the 2nd pass," he said. "He always takes the 2nd pass. He has been taking it for 2 years. If we are inside before the 2nd pass begins, we will not see him. We will be inside before the 2nd pass begins," Syrio said. Sandor moved his finger to a room on the 4th level. "And here." "Yes, if he calls for them, he will not have the opportunity," Jon said. Sandor looked at him across the map. "You're certain?" "No," Jon said. "But I know where the bell pull is, and I know how far it is from his bed to the bell pull, and I know what a boy does in the half-second between intending to move and moving, and that half-second is enough." Sandor looked at the map for another moment. Then he stood. "No deaths," he said. It was not a question. He was establishing the terms so that there was no ambiguity later, which was the way Sandor established all things he considered non-negotiable, by stating them once, flatly, without discussion. "No deaths," Jon agreed. Syrio rolled the map and put the candle out. The Red Keep at night smelled of torch smoke and old stone, and the specific sweetness of a place where power had lived for a long time and slowly concentrated. Like salt in a vessel where the water had been evaporating for years. There was food underneath it, the kitchens ran until well past midnight, and the smell of roasted meat had soaked into the lower corridor stones over generations. And below that, the cold mineral smell of the black water seeping up through the hill's foundations, unchanged and indifferent to everything that had been built above it. They moved through the kitchen corridor in single file. Syrio first, then Jon, Then Sandor, who reduced his footfall to almost nothing in the way of a large man who had learned that silence was not a matter of size but of weight distribution, of knowing which part of the foot to lead with and how to transfer down through the ankle rather than dropping into the stone. The sculleries were dark. Sleeping shapes on pallets against the walls, children mostly, the lowest household staff who ate and slept in the same rooms where they worked. Jon moved past them with his breath controlled, and his eyes on Syrio's back, and his attention on the room rather than on any single thing in it. The door at the kitchen corridor's end had been receiving oil on its hinges every third night for a month. Syrio applied it as part of his evening rounds, the master of accounts, Braavosi affairs, taking the long way back from a meeting, pausing at a door to adjust something minor. Nobody noticed. Nobody had ever noticed. This was the thing about being invisible to power. Power was its own distraction. If you did not look like a threat and did not look like a resource, you became part of the building. And people moved around you the way they moved around furniture. The door opened. No sound. 2 corridors. A stair. A manufactured sound from 40 feet east. Syrio had placed a loose bracket on a torch fitting 3 days ago, and a length of thread connected the bracket to a small weight suspended in the stairwell, and when Sandor's shoulder brushed the thread on the way past. The bracket shifted and the torch moved, and the sound it made was exactly the sound of a bored guard adjusting his position in cold armor, and the actual guard at the corridor junction north of them turned his head toward the sound and held it there for the 6 seconds that 6 seconds required. They were past his sight line in 4. Joffrey's bedchamber was at the 4th level's south corner, positioned for the view, the city in one direction, the bay in the other, the world arranged around a boy who had been told since before he could speak that the world arranged itself around him. He was awake. Jon had considered this possibility and had not spent significant time worrying about it because whether Joffrey was awake or asleep changed the first 4 seconds and nothing after that. He lay in the large bed with his eyes open, and the specific restless quality of a boy whose own cruelties had begun returning to him at night in forms he could not control. Which was perhaps the only honest accounting that Joffrey's mind ever performed, the one that happened in the dark when he had no audience to perform for. He was 12 years old. In the candlelight stripped of the prince's costume and the Kingsguard and the court, he looked it, a boy with his mother's eyes and too much power and not enough years to understand the weight of either. His eyes moved to the door when it opened. His hand moved to the bell pull beside the bed. Jon was between him and the bell pull before the hand arrived. He had not rushed. He had moved at the pace the distance required, and no faster, which was fast enough, and now he stood between the bed and the wall, and Joffrey was looking at him with the face of someone who had made a very quick and very accurate assessment of the situation, and did not like what the assessment said. "The windows are latched," Jon said. "I checked them this morning." He said it conversationally, the way you'd mention the weather. "The Kingsguard rotation has 7 minutes remaining. That's time enough for what we need." Joffrey opened his mouth. The rage came first. It always came first with him. The reflex of a boy who had learned that his rage was a weapon other people felt. His voice had not finished breaking, and the rage that came out of it had the cracked, uneven quality of something that hadn't yet settled into what it was going to be. Jon waited. The rage ran its course. It ran faster than it usually did, because there was nothing in Jon's face for it to catch on. No fear, no deference, no performance of being affected by it. After 30 seconds, the rage began to deflate in the way of things that required an audience and had discovered they didn't have one. What came next was the performance of bravery. Joffrey sat up straighter. His voice found a lower register than it reliably had yet. "Do you know what they do to people who enter the king's bedchamber uninvited?" "I know what they do to boys who push cripples from windows," Jon said. "I know what they do to queens who pass bastards as princes. I know what they do to families who arrange the murder of a 7-year-old through hired killers with Valyrian steel daggers." He let a moment go past. "I have the Catspaw's confession. I have Bran Stark's account, which he gave to Maester Luwin when he woke at Winterfell, recorded in Luwin's hand and sent south by Raven. I have the testimony of 2 people who were in the room when the dagger was identified." A pause. "I also have a letter, in your mother's hand, that was intercepted 6 days ago and which names the dagger's owner. Joffrey's performance of bravery ran out faster than the rage had. What was left underneath was something Jon recognized, in the corridor with the gold cloaks, in the face of the first man who had stopped when he saw what was waiting. The recognition that a specific plan had encountered a specific obstacle that the plan had not included, and that the obstacle was not movable. Joffrey was 12 years old. In the candlelight, without the court around him, he was just a boy whose plan had failed. The cruelty was real, Jon did not minimize it, but it existed in a body that was still 12, and 12-year-old bodies had limits to what they could perform when they were alone in a room at midnight with no guards and no bell pull they could reach. "What do you want?" Joffrey said. His voice had come down to something close to its actual register. Jon took parchment from inside his cloak. A quill. He set them on the bedside table. "You are going to write 4 letters," Jon said. "I will tell you what they say. When you are finished, everyone in this room will still be breathing, and you will still be alive. And you will remain alive for as long as the contents of those letters remain operative." He looked at the parchment, then at Joffrey. "That is the only outcome currently available to you that includes your continued existence. Take it." Joffrey looked at the parchment. He looked at Jon. He picked up the quill. The kitchen corridor again. The sleeping sculleries. The cold mineral smell of the foundations. They were outside the Tower of the Hand before Sandor spoke. "You didn't kill him," Sandor said. "No," they walked. "I would have," Sandor said. "I know." The city was quiet around them, the particular quiet of the last hours before dawn when even King's Landing ran out of reasons to be awake. Somewhere near the harbor, a ship's bell moved in the water. After a while, Syrio said, "There is a difference between the lesson of the cat and the lesson of the dog." Sandor looked at him. It was too dark to read the look, but the quality of the silence that followed it was specific. "What's the difference?" Sandor said. Syrio walked 3 more steps. "The cat," he said, "always leaves them alive enough to be afraid of the dark." Tywin Lannister did not rage. This was the thing that separated him from other powerful men and made him more dangerous than all of them. Other powerful men, when crossed, produced heat, visible, audible, trackable heat that told you exactly what they felt and exactly what they were about to do. Tywin produced nothing. He received information that would have broken lesser men across a table, and he sat with it. And he thought. And the thinking was invisible, and what emerged from the thinking was not anger but calculation, which was far worse because calculation could be patient in ways that anger never was. Jon understood this about Tywin Lannister from the information that had moved through Littlefinger's adjusted network over 6 weeks. He understood it the way Syrio had taught him to understand opponents before engaging them, not through confrontation but through observation, through the accumulated picture of 100 small decisions that, taken together, described the decision-making architecture of a mind. He had spent 3 days preparing for this conversation. He would not be in the room for it. Varys came to the Tower of the Hand's lower room on the morning of the 8th day. He came alone, in plain robes the color of old stone, moving through the tower's lower corridor with the particular glide of a man whose body had learned to pass through spaces without disturbing them. Jon had chosen the lower room deliberately. No windows. 1 door. The map was gone, the floor clear, 2 chairs and a table with water and nothing else. The room said, "This is a conversation between people who have agreed to speak plainly, and the plainness of the space is the first evidence of that agreement." Varys sat. He looked at Jon with the mild, attentive expression he used as a default surface, the face of a man who was interested in you in the way that someone might be interested in a complex piece of machinery, with appreciation for the craft rather than investment in the outcome. "The Master of Whisperers," Jon said. "Not Littlefinger." "Lord Baelish and I have different interests," Varys said. "We occasionally share methods. We rarely share goals." He folded his hands in his lap. "You have been adjusting his network for 6 weeks. He has not yet identified the mechanism. He has identified the outcomes, 3 predictions that failed to manifest, 2 pieces of information that proved incorrect in ways that were not immediately traceable. He believes he has a problem with one of his sources in the 4th-level corridor watch. He does not believe the problem is systemic." A pause. "He is wrong. I know he's wrong," Jon said. "I know that you know." Varys looked at the table between them. "I am here because Lord Lannister, the elder Lord Lannister, at Casterly Rock, received a raven 4 days ago. The raven described events in the Red Keep with a specificity that required either a source very close to those events or a source who had been given a detailed account by someone very close to them." He looked up. "Lord Lannister wishes to understand his position." "His position," Jon said, "is what I'm here to explain." The terms moved through Varys to Casterly Rock and back over the following 2 days. Jon did not write them down. Writing created objects that traveled to places you hadn't sent them. He gave Varys the terms in the lower room with the single candle and the bare floor, and Varys carried them in his head, which was the most secure archive in the 7 kingdoms. The facts, as Jon presented them, Joffrey's 4 letters existed, and were in safekeeping in locations that Jon did not specify. The letters were in Joffrey's hand, and bore the royal seal, and their contents were sufficient, if produced before witnesses of sufficient standing, to establish the facts of the Queen's children's parentage, the Catspaw's origin, and the events surrounding the former Hand's murder. The evidence of the incest was triangulated across 3 independent sources, none of which were the letters themselves. Robert Baratheon was alive, had been informed of the broad outlines of the situation, and was in a state of fury that had not yet resolved into direction. The last point was the most significant. Robert's fury was currently undirected. It was a fire in a room with many things that could burn. Tywin Lannister could let it find its own direction, which would be toward whatever was nearest and most flammable. Or the situation could be resolved in a manner that gave the fire a specific, limited, survivable outlet. The optimal resolution. As Jon framed it, Cersei's children remained legitimate for the present. The evidence was sealed, not destroyed, sealed, held, its existence known to enough people that its destruction would not eliminate the knowledge of its existence. Ned Stark's authority as Hand of the King was formally restored and formally protected. The investigation into Jon Arryn's death was formally opened under Ned's direction, and Jaime Lannister resigned from the Kingsguard and returned to Casterly Rock, which returned him to the line of Lannister succession and solved a problem Tywin had held for years: his heir, wasted in a white cloak, unable to inherit, unable to continue the line. Varys carried this to Casterly Rock. He carried Tywin's response back in 48 hours, which was faster than the Ravens should have allowed, which told Jon something about how Varys moved information when he chose to move it quickly. Tywin's counterproposal changed 4 words. The investigation into Jon Arryn's death would be opened, but conducted jointly, a Lannister representative alongside Ned's own. The word jointly was the change. It was the word of a man who could not accept terms without modifying them, not because the modification had strategic value, but because accepting without modification was a form of submission, and Tywin Lannister had not submitted to anything in 40 years, and was not prepared to start. Jon accepted the modification. Syrio was sitting in the lower room when Jon told him. He looked at the single candle for a moment. He accepted the first terms, he said. Yes, the change to the investigation clause is cosmetic. A Lannister representative in the investigation changes the investigation's speed, not its conclusions. The conclusions are already determined by the evidence, which he knows exists. Syrio turned the candle's base on the table, a small rotation, a thinking gesture. Why did he accept so quickly? Jon said he needed to change one word, so he could tell himself he negotiated. Syrio looked at him across the table. The look lasted 4 seconds. It was the look Syrio used when a student had produced something that required no correction, which was a look Jon had seen perhaps 8 times in 7 years, and which he recognized by the specific quality of the silence that accompanied it. "You are ready," Syrio said. He did not explain for what. The raven from the north arrived on the morning of the 10th day. Jon was at the window when Ned brought it to him. The city was doing its morning work below, the market sounds, the cart wheels on the cobblestones, the harbor bell moving in the water. Ned set the letter on the table and stepped back and let Jon read it. Robb had called his banners 20,000 men. The northern lords had answered inside a week: the Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Umbers, the Glovers, the Tallhearts, all of them riding south under the grey direwolf, responding to a letter from their liege lord's son that described the threat to Ned Stark as a threat to the North itself, which in the political architecture of the Northern mind was not a metaphor, but a literal truth. He did not yet know the situation had changed. Ravens traveled slower than armies, and Robb's army had moved fast. Ned said, "He'll be past Moat Cailin in 3 days." Jon looked at the letter for a moment longer. Then he looked out the window at the city, at the Red Keep's walls visible over the rooftops, at the specific geometry of power that he had spent 2 months learning to read. "Good," he said. Ned looked at him. "Tywin Lannister accepted terms 2 days ago," Jon said. "The stalemate holds. But it holds because the cost of breaking it is higher than the cost of maintaining it. That calculation depends on what's available to both sides." He set the letter on the table. 2 days ago, breaking the stalemate cost Tywin a political exposure he wasn't prepared for. Now it costs him that and 20,000 northern soldiers crossing the neck. He looked at Ned. The stalemate doesn't weaken when Robb arrives. It becomes permanent. Ned was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. He looked at his son, and the word required adjustment even now. Even after everything. His son, Lyanna's son, the boy he had carried out of a tower in Dorne and carried across the years and brought here to this room where he stood at a window and told Tywin Lannister's calculation back to himself in 4 sentences. "You should write to him," Ned said. "Tell him to hold at the neck. Let him know it's done." "I will," Jon said, "but let him march another day first." Ned looked at him. "Tywin will know the raven came," Jon said. "He'll know I received it. He'll watch what I do with it. If I stop Robb immediately, he knows the army was leverage I was willing to spend. If I wait a day before stopping him," Jon looked out the window, "he'll wonder what I was waiting for. He'll spend the next week deciding what I was holding back." A silence. "Your mother," Ned said, quietly, to the room rather than to Jon, "would have loved to see this." He picked up the letter, folded it, held it for a moment. "I'll draft the raven to Robb," he said. "We send it tomorrow morning." He left. Jon stayed at the window. The city moved below him, indifferent, ancient, full of the 10,000 calculations that kept it functioning, debts and loyalties and fears, and the constant low-grade management of power that never stopped and never fully resolved and never produced anything that stayed stable without continuous maintenance. He had spent 6 weeks learning to read it. He was beginning to understand that reading it was not the same as understanding it, and understanding it was not the same as surviving it, and surviving it was not the same as changing it. He looked at the Red Keep across the rooftops. He was 15 years old. He had a very great deal left to learn. The North received them the way the North received everything, without ceremony, without excess. With the specific grey patience of a country that had been here before any of the people crossing it, and expected to be here long after. They crossed Moat Cailin on a morning when the sky was the color of unpolished steel, and the air coming down from the far north carried the first serious cold of the approaching season. Jon felt it the moment they rode through the ancient ruined towers of the next gateway, felt it on his face, in his lungs, in the specific loosening of something that had been held tight for 2 months without his fully noticing how tight. He breathed in. Pine, stone, the mineral cold of ground that froze deep and stayed frozen and was honest about it. Ghost ran ahead on the road, white against the gray, moving with the particular energy of an animal returning to a territory it understood. He disappeared into the pine line and reappeared at intervals, and each time he reappeared Jon noted him and said nothing. He did not look back at the neck. Winterfell received them at dusk. The gate came down, and the torches were lit, and the household came out in the way of households that had been waiting and were now done waiting, not celebration, just the resumption of normal gravity after an absence that had bent things sideways. Servants, guards, Maester Luwin in his chain and his practical face. Robb, who had turned back from the neck on the Raven's instruction and arrived home 4 days ahead of them, who stood in the yard with the controlled relief of a young man who had spent 6 weeks not saying how frightened he had been. Robb and Ned embraced. Jon dismounted and led his horse to the stable himself, and the stable smelled the same as it had always smelled. Hay and warm animal and the particular piece of large creatures that did not require anything from you except proximity, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck and breathed it. Ghost padded in behind him. Lay down. Watched. Sandor Clegane was in the yard when Jon came back out. He was not unpacking. He had a single bag at his feet that had never been fully packed in the first place, and he was looking at the castle's walls with the expression of a man who had made a decision while traveling and was now in the place where the decision became real. Jon stopped beside him. They stood there in the cold for a moment. "East," Sandor said. Not an answer to a question, just placing the word. Jon looked at him. "There are things I haven't settled," Sandor said. He didn't elaborate. The things he hadn't settled were their own story, and he wasn't offering to tell it, and Jon wasn't going to ask. "The axe is by your door. Third room, east corridor." He picked up his bag. "You'll know what it's for." He walked to the gate. He walked through it. Jon watched him go until the dark took him, and then stood in the empty yard for a moment longer, and then went inside. The axe was where Sandor had said it was. A Clegane war axe, heavy, the handle worn smooth in a specific pattern that mapped exactly to the grip of a very large man who had used it for a long time. Not ceremonial. Not decorative. A tool, kept with the care of someone who took tools seriously. Jon picked it up. Set it back down. Looked at it for a moment. On the bed beside it a sword in a plain scabbard. The blade was short, too short for Jon really, built for smaller hands and a shorter reach, but the grip had been replaced recently. New leather, rewrapped with the tight. Precise technique of someone who had done it hundreds of times, the binding ending in a knot at the pommel that Jon recognized because he had seen it tied twice a week for 7 years. He sat on the bed and held the sword in his lap for a long time. Syrio had not said goodbye. This was, Jon understood, because Syrio did not say goodbye. Syrio had left something in its place which was more durable than goodbye and more honest, a sword rebalanced for a different fighter, a thing he had made useful again with his hands before passing it forward, because that was what Syrio did with things that mattered. He made them useful, and then he let them go. Jon set the sword beside the axe. Ghost jumped onto the bed beside him, which was something Ghost had never done before. He lay down, pressed against Jon's side, and was still. Jon put his hand in the white fur. Neither of them moved for a while. He did not sleep for a long time. Ned came for him the following evening. He said nothing in the corridor, just the slight inclination of his head that meant, "Come." Jon followed him through the east wing and down the familiar stair, and through the narrow door that always needed lifting slightly on its hinges, and the smell of the crypts came up to meet them. Cold stone, old dust. The particular, underground stillness of a place that had been sealed from the weather for so long it had developed its own climate. They passed Brandon. Rickard, the ancient kings of winter in their stone chairs with their iron swords across their laps, their faces worn by the years until the features were suggestions rather than descriptions. The torches threw orange light that moved on the walls and made the shadows of the statues shift and seem to breathe. Ned stopped at Lyanna's tomb. He had carried a single torch. The light it threw was limited, enough to see the carved stone face above the effigy, the long hair, the hands folded at the chest, the stone rose between the stone fingers. Someone replaced the roses periodically. Jon had always wondered who. He understood now that it was Ned, that it had always been Ned, making the small pilgrimage alone, leaving the flower, saying the thing he could not say in any room where someone might hear him. Ghost had followed them down. He lay at the foot of Lyanna's tomb in the dark, white against the black stone floor, his red eyes reflecting the torchlight like two coals. He made no sound. Ned sat on the floor. He looked, for the first time in Jon's memory, like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. He began with Lyanna, not with the Tower of Joy, not with the war, with a girl, with a specific girl at a specific tournament at Harrenhal, a girl who rode better than her brothers and laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny, and refused what was expected of her with the cheerful certainty of someone who had never seriously considered that refusal was optional. With a silver-haired prince who had ridden past 100 women and stopped. and the blue winter rose he had placed in her hands, and what had followed from that was not the kidnapping the stories described, but something that the stories were not built to contain and so had simplified into something usable. He told it without looking at Jon. He told it to the stone floor, to the carved face above them, to the woman who had made him promise, and then left him with the promise and the boy and the long years of carrying both. Jon listened without moving. The torch burned lower, the shadows lengthened on the walls. The faces of the dead kings watched from their alcoves with their worn features and their iron swords and their absolute patience with what the living chose to do with themselves. When Ned finished, the silence was complete. Jon sat in it. He was not experiencing what he might have expected to experience. He had imagined this moment before, had known without fully knowing how he knew, that there was something beneath the surface of his life that had not yet been named. He had imagined revelation as something that arrived with force, that rearranged the room. What it actually felt like was different. It felt like a very old ache resolving, not going away but shifting, changing character, becoming something he now had a name for and could therefore carry differently. Jon Snow. Aegon Targaryen. Both names fit and neither fit completely, and the space between them was the space he actually lived in, which was 15 years of a specific life lived in a specific castle with specific people who had shaped every reflex he had, and every decision he made, and every version of himself he could imagine being. He said, "Did you ever intend to tell me?" Ned looked at him for the first time since they had sat down. Yes, quiet, direct. Ned did not soften things when the softening would be dishonest, when you were safe enough that knowing wouldn't destroy you. And now, Ned looked at him, at the scarred, lean, still young man who had walked into the Red Keep of King's Landing and walked back out with Tywin Lannister's capitulation in 4 letters, and a sealed evidence chest, and a stalemate that was holding, because Jon had waited 1 extra day to send a raven and used that day as a feint. "Now," Ned said, "I think you already know." Jon looked at Lyanna's carved face. He looked at it for a long time. The torchlight moved across it. The stone features shifted slightly in the movement of the light, not alive, but not entirely without life, the way all faces held something regardless of what they were made of. "Her eyes," Jon said. His voice was level, quiet, not broken, just true. "They're like mine." It was not a question. Ned did not answer it. He did not need to. He reached into his cloak and placed something on the stone floor between them, a piece of folded parchment, old, the edges soft from years of handling. Jon looked at it without picking it up. Howland Reed wrote that the year after, Ned said. Everything he witnessed, everything she said. Her words, as close as he could remember them. He paused. "It belongs to you." Jon picked it up. Held it. Did not open it. Not tonight. Ghost rose from the foot of the tomb, walked to Jon and lay down again against his leg. The warmth of the animal was the only warm thing in the crypts. Jon put his free hand in the white fur and held the folded letter in the other, and sat with it in the underground dark, with the dead kings watching, and his father, the word still fit, would always fit. Blood was not the only thing that made a father. Sitting across from him on the cold floor, both of them quiet in the way of people who had arrived somewhere after a very long road and did not yet need to decide what came next. The great hall of Winterfell was empty when Jon walked into it an hour later. The long tables had been cleared, and the fire in the central hearth had burned down to orange coals that threw low heat and lower light. The direwolf sigil looked down from the wall above the hearth, gray on gray. The colors of winter and stone, and the North's specific refusal to be anything other than what it was. Jon stood in the center of the hall. In his left hand, the short sword with the rebound grip, Syrio's farewell. In his right, the Clegane war axe, heavy, honest. Ghost sat at his heel and watched him with those red eyes, and Jon stood in the empty hall with both weapons and looked at the door. North, through the walls and the darkness and the miles of pine forest and the ancient stones of Moat Cailin and the cold flat marshland of the Neck, and beyond all of that, the wall. 700 feet of ice that had stood for 8,000 years holding something back that the realm had decided was a myth, because myths were easier than preparation. Jon knew what was coming. He knew it the way Syrio had taught him to know things, not by examining the threat directly, but by reading the space around it, by watching what it displaced, by understanding that the cold coming down from the far north was not weather. The political settlement in King's Landing was holding. The Lannisters were contained. Ned Stark was home and alive and whole. Robb was in Winterfell learning to be the lord he would need to be. The things that had been coming had been redirected or delayed or, in some cases, simply stopped. But there were things that could not be redirected or delayed or stopped. Things that did not negotiate. Things that did not respond to information networks or adjusted intelligence or 4 letters in a royal hand. Jon looked at the door. At the north, the coals in the hearth shifted and sent up a small spray of orange sparks that rose and went out in the cold air of the hall and left the room darker than it had been. He had a great deal left to do. He was ready to begin. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.